The summer of 1882 hung over Henrico County like a suffocating blanket, heavy with the scent of ripening tobacco and something else, something sweet and metallic that seemed to drift from the direction of the Caldwell estate. Sheriff William Tappan pulled his horse to a halt at the crossroads, wiping sweat from his brow as he stared down the overgrown path leading to the mansion. "You sure about this, Sheriff?" Deputy Marcus Webb shifted nervously in his saddle, his young face pale despite the oppressive heat. "Folks say things ain't right up there. Haven't been right since old Judge Caldwell passed." Tappan's jaw tightened. 3 weeks had passed since Mary Hutchins, Sarah Fleming, and little Beth Morrison had disappeared. All three had worked as domestic help for the Caldwell family, and all three had vanished without a trace on the same sultry evening. The only clue was Beth's torn apron, found snagged on a thorn bush near the mansion's iron gates. "Things haven't been right since Jasper took over," Tappan muttered, spurring his horse forward. "That boy's always been strange, but this—" He shook his head. 3 women don't just disappear into thin air. The Caldwell mansion loomed ahead through the humidity haze, its once grand Georgian facade now darkened by neglect. Every window on the lower floors had been boarded shut with thick planks, while heavy black curtains blocked any view into the upper stories. The gardens that had once been the pride of Virginia society now grew wild and untended, roses climbing the walls in blood-red tangles. As they approached the gates, Tappan noticed fresh scratches in the dirt, deep gouges, as if someone had been dragged along the ground. The sweet, cloying scent grew stronger here, jasmine mixed with something that made his stomach turn. "Sheriff," Webb whispered, pointing toward the mansion's east wing. "Look at them windows." Tappan followed his deputy's gaze and felt his blood chill. Despite the afternoon sun blazing overhead, a faint golden glow emanated from behind the curtains of the third-floor windows. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat made of light. The sound reached them then, a low, melodic humming that seemed to come from within the very walls of the mansion. It wasn't quite music, but it wasn't quite human either. It rose and fell with hypnotic regularity, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like muffled voices raised in unison. "Jesus Christ," Webb breathed, making the sign of the cross. Tappan dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to turn around and ride back to town. But those 3 women— "Stay close," he told Webb as they approached the front door. The massive oak portal stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Tappan pressed his ear to the gap and immediately jerked back. The humming was louder here, and underneath it he could hear something else. Soft gasping, rhythmic and desperate, like someone struggling for breath. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun. The interior of the mansion was a study in decay and decadence. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that managed to penetrate the gloom, illuminating furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts. The air was thick with that sweet, nauseating scent, so concentrated now that Tappan had to breathe through his mouth to keep from gagging. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast foyer. "This is Sheriff Tappan. I need to speak with Jasper Caldwell." The humming stopped abruptly, leaving only an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Then from somewhere high above came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across what sounded like a wooden floor. Webb grabbed Tappan's arm. "Sheriff, look at this!" The young deputy was staring at the grand staircase that curved up to the mansion's upper floors. The normally pale wood was stained dark in several places, and in the dim light, those stains looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Mr. Caldwell!" Tappan called again, louder this time. "I'm coming up." As they climbed the stairs, Tappan noticed more details that made his skin crawl. The family portraits that had once lined the walls were now turned to face inward, their backs to the room. Strange symbols had been carved into the wooden banister, Circles within circles, intersected by lines that hurt to look at directly. The second floor was even darker than the first, but they could see light seeping from beneath a door at the end of the hallway. The sweet scent was overwhelming here, mixed with something else, incense perhaps, or burning herbs. Tappan approached the door cautiously, Webb close behind. Through the keyhole, he could see flickering candlelight and what appeared to be figures moving in a slow, ritualistic dance. "Open up!" he shouted, pounding on the door with his fist. "Sheriff's Department!" The movement inside ceased immediately. After a moment, they heard the sound of multiple locks being turned, and the door swung open to reveal Jasper Caldwell himself. The man before them bore little resemblance to the respected judge's son, who had once been a pillar of Richmond society. Jasper's once neat appearance had deteriorated into something wild and unkempt. His dark hair hung in greasy strands around his shoulders, and his clothes, expensive silk and velvet, were stained and rumpled. But it was his eyes that truly disturbed Tappan. They held a fevered brightness, the look of a man who had gazed too long into an abyss and found something staring back. "Sheriff Tappan," Jasper said, his voice cultured but strangely breathless. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "3 women have gone missing," Tappan said bluntly. "All 3 worked for your family. I need to search the premises." Jasper's lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes. "Missing? How unfortunate." "I'm afraid I can't help you, Sheriff. I've been indisposed lately, researching certain theological matters that require absolute privacy." Over Jasper's shoulder, Tappan could see into the room beyond. Heavy red curtains covered the windows, and the floor was scattered with white rose petals that looked black in the candlelight. Several figures stood motionless in the shadows, men and women dressed in flowing robes, their faces hidden by masks of polished silver. "Who are your guests, Mr. Caldwell?" Tappan demanded. "Scholars," Jasper replied smoothly. "We're engaged in a study of ancient texts. Surely you wouldn't interrupt such important work." But Tappan had seen enough. Among the rose petals on the floor, he could make out darker stains, and the metallic scent beneath the jasmine was definitely blood. "I'm placing you under arrest for suspicion of—" "I think not," Jasper said softly. The masked figures began to move forward, and Tappan realized with growing horror that their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if they were all part of the same organism. Their silver masks reflected the candlelight in disturbing ways, creating the illusion of constantly shifting expressions. "Run," Tappan whispered to Webb, but when he turned, his deputy was gone. In his place stood another masked figure, this one shorter than the rest, wearing what looked like a torn and blooded apron. The figure reached up with pale, delicate hands and slowly removed its mask, revealing the face of Beth Morrison, or what had been Beth Morrison. Her skin was waxy and white, her eyes rolled back to show only the whites, and her mouth was stretched in a permanent, ecstatic smile. "She's so happy now," Jasper whispered, his breath hot against Tappan's ear. "They all are. The flesh is weak, Sheriff, but the spirit can be taught to sing in ways you never imagined." Tappan tried to draw his gun, but his hand wouldn't obey him. The sweet scent was filling his lungs, making his thoughts sluggish and strange. Around him, the masked figures began to hum again, that same hypnotic melody that seemed to burrow into his brain like a living thing. "Don't fight it," Jasper murmured. "Let us show you what ecstasy truly means." The last thing Tappan saw before the darkness claimed him was the ceiling above, painted with more of those horrible symbols, arranged in patterns that seemed to move and writhe in the flickering candlelight, as if the very geometry of the room was alive and hungry. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Richmond Theological Seminary, as Father Benedict Hawthorne paced the gravel path between the dormitories. In his weathered hands, he clutched a letter that had arrived with the dawn, another inquiry from worried parents about their missing son. "Timothy Marsh," he murmured to himself, scanning the neat handwriting once more. Last seen 3 days ago, heading toward Henrico County for his evening meditation walk. Father Hawthorne was no stranger to the wanderings of young seminarians. The path to ordination was fraught with doubt and temptation, and more than one promising student had simply vanished into the night, unable to bear the weight of their calling. But Timothy had been different, devout, disciplined, showing none of the signs of spiritual crisis that usually preceded such departures. The priest made his way to Timothy's small dormitory room, hoping to find some clue to the young man's whereabouts. The space was spartanly furnished. A narrow bed, a wooden desk scarred by years of use, and a small bookshelf lined with theological texts. Everything was in perfect order, exactly as Timothy would have left it for evening prayers, everything except for the journal. Father Hawthorne found it wedged between the mattress and the wall, as if hastily hidden. The leather binding was worn smooth by countless hours of handling, and when he opened it, Timothy's careful script filled page after page. Most entries were mundane, reflections on sermons, struggles with Latin translation, concerns about an upcoming examination. But as Father Hawthorne read deeper, the tone began to change. June 15th, 1882. I have been experiencing the most vivid dreams. In them, I hear singing unlike anything in our hymnal. The voices seem to call to me, promising revelations beyond Scripture. Brother Marcus says I speak in my sleep now, but I cannot remember what I say. June 18th. The dreams have grown stronger. I see a great house surrounded by gardens of white roses that bleed red at their hearts. A man with kind eyes tells me that God's love is vaster than the church teaches, that there are forms of worship that transcend the flesh entirely. I wake with such longing that I weep. June 22nd. I must find the source of these visions. The compulsion grows daily, like a hunger that prayer cannot satisfy. Tonight, I will walk toward Henrico County. If I do not return, know that I go willingly to seek a deeper communion with the divine. Father Hawthorne set down the journal with trembling hands. In 40 years of ministry, he had encountered many forms of spiritual delusion, but this felt different, darker. The careful progression from doubt to obsession, the specific imagery of roses and singing, the references to transcendent worship. It reminded him of cases he had read about in the church's most restricted archives. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Brother Marcus Fitzpatrick entered, his young face creased with worry. "Father, have you learned anything about Timothy? The other students are asking questions I cannot answer." "Sit down, my son," Father Hawthorne said heavily. "I fear our brother may have fallen under a most dangerous influence." He showed Marcus the journal entries, watching the color drain from the young monk's face as he read. When Marcus finished, he looked up with haunted eyes. "Father, Timothy mentioned my name. He said I speak in my sleep, but I have no recollection of this." "Tell me about your dreams, Marcus." The young man was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched in his lap. I have been having them too. The same house, the same roses, and the singing, Father. It's so beautiful it makes my chest ache. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing at the window, looking toward the county road, as if something calls to me there. Father Hawthorne felt ice form in the pit of his stomach. If the influence was spreading among his students, how many others have mentioned strange dreams? 7 that I know of, perhaps more who haven't spoken of it. "God preserve us," the priest whispered. He rose abruptly, moving to the small safe hidden behind a painting of St. Augustine. From it, he withdrew a slim volume bound in black leather, a book that officially did not exist in the seminary's collection. "Father, what is that?" "Manifestations of Spiritual Corruption in Colonial America," compiled by the Church's Investigative Commission in 1789, Father Hawthorne said grimly. "I had hoped never to need it." He opened the book to a chapter marked with a strip of red ribbon. The page header read, "The Caldwell Heresy, Henrico County, Virginia, 1781. "Read this aloud, Marcus." The young monk's voice wavered as he began. In the summer of 1781, Judge Ezekiel Caldwell reported the discovery of an underground chamber beneath his newly purchased estate. The chamber contained evidence of ritualistic activities predating the house's construction, including altars dedicated to entities not recognized by Christian doctrine. Caldwell, a devout man, ordered the chamber sealed and blessed. However, within months, he began reporting vivid dreams of angelic visitations that urged him to reopen the space for higher forms of worship. Marcus stopped reading, his face pale. "Father, this is—" Continue. The influence spread to Caldwell's household staff and extended family. Those affected described overwhelming compulsions to gather in the sealed chamber, where they engaged in practices that witnesses described as blasphemous in their ecstasy. But when church authorities investigated, they found evidence of blood sacrifice, sexual rituals performed in the name of false deities, and texts written in unknown languages that caused madness in those who attempted to read them. Father Hawthorne took back the book. The church managed to contain the outbreak, but only after 17 people had vanished entirely. The chamber was filled with blessed concrete and the land consecrated. Judge Caldwell and his immediate family were relocated under church protection, and new identities were established for the survivors. But Father, if this happened over a century ago, the Caldwell family remained in the area, Marcus. They changed their name and their public face, but they never left. And it seems the influence was never truly destroyed, merely dormant. The sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. Brother Francis burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed with exertion and terror. "Father, come quickly. We found him. We found Timothy." They followed Francis across the seminary grounds to the old oak grove, where the students often went for solitary prayer. A cluster of seminarians stood in a tight circle, their faces pale with shock. As Father Hawthorne approached, they parted to reveal what lay at the base of the largest oak. Timothy Marsh was bound to the ancient tree's roots with what appeared to be silk cords, but he was alive, horribly, impossibly alive. His eyes rolled back in his head, showing only white, and from his throat came a continuous, wordless humming that made the listening priests feel physically ill. His clothes were gone, replaced by a robe of deep crimson that seemed to shift and move in the windless air. But it was Timothy's expression that truly disturbed them. Despite his obvious distress, his face was locked in an expression of profound ecstasy, as if he were experiencing pleasure beyond human comprehension. "How long has he been like this?" Father Hawthorne demanded. "We don't know," Francis stammered. "We found him at dawn, but he could have been here all night. Father, we can't wake him. He doesn't respond to anything." Father Hawthorne knelt beside the bound seminarian, careful not to touch him directly. Timothy's skin was waxy and cool, and there were marks on his wrists and ankles that looked like burn scars in the shape of symbols. The humming never ceased, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed designed to burrow into the listener's brain. "Get me holy water and my exorcism kit," the priest ordered, "and send someone to town for the sheriff, though I fear he may not be able to help us." As the students scattered to follow his orders, Father Hawthorne remained kneeling beside Timothy, studying the symbol-shaped burns on the young man's flesh. He had seen similar markings in the forbidden texts, signs of binding that went far deeper than mere rope and silk. Timothy's humming suddenly changed pitch, becoming more urgent, more insistent. Other voices began to join it. The seminarians who had gathered to watch were unconsciously adding their own voices to the horrible melody. Father Hawthorne realized with growing horror that the influence was spreading even now, using Timothy as some sort of beacon. "Stop!" he shouted, breaking the spell. The students stumbled backward, confusion replacing the dreamy expressions on their faces. "No one else approaches. Form a prayer circle at least 50 feet away and do not listen to the humming." But even as he gave the orders, Father Hawthorne could feel the insidious pull of that otherworldly music. It promised such beautiful things. Communion beyond the limitations of flesh, ecstasy that transcended earthly pleasure, knowledge that would make the mysteries of faith seem like children's games. He forced himself to look away from Timothy's rapturous face and focus on the burn marks. If he could understand the symbols, perhaps he could find a way to break whatever hold the Caldwell influence had on the young man. What he saw made his blood run cold. The burns weren't random. They formed a map. And at the center of that map, clearly marked in scar tissue on Timothy's chest, was the location of the Caldwell estate. Timothy was more than a victim. He was an invitation. Sheriff William Tappan awoke to the sensation of silk against his skin and the sound of distant screaming. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he had arrived there. Then the memories crashed back. The Caldwell mansion, the masked figures, the sweet, cloying scent that had stolen his consciousness. He tried to sit up and found himself restrained by crimson silk cords that bound his wrists and ankles to what appeared to be an ornate four-poster bed. The mattress beneath him was covered in velvet, the color of fresh blood, and the air was thick with that same nauseating mixture of jasmine and iron. The room around him was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were draped in heavy red fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an oppressive atmosphere of perpetual twilight. Mirrors lined every surface. Full-length mirrors, hand mirrors, mirrors set into the ceiling above the bed. But each one had been turned to face the wall, their reflective surfaces hidden from view. Candles burned in elaborate silver candelabras, their flames dancing in patterns that hurt to watch directly. The wax that dripped from them was not white or yellow, but a disturbing shade of deep red that pooled on the floor like congealed blood. "You're awake," a voice said from the shadows. "How delightful." Jasper Caldwell emerged from behind a curtain, but the man who approached the bed bore even less resemblance to the respected judge's son than before. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that revealed the dark veins beneath, and his eyes now held flecks of gold that seemed to swirl with their own inner light. He wore a robe of the same crimson silk that bound Tappan, but underneath it, the sheriff could see that Jasper's chest was covered in scars, symbols cut deep into the flesh and allowed to heal badly, creating a permanent map of blasphemous markings. "Where is my deputy?" Tappan demanded, struggling against his bonds. "Where are the missing women?" Jasper laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, they're here, Sheriff. They're all here, and they're experiencing such exquisite pleasures." He gestured toward a section of the wall where the fabric hung differently. "Would you like to see?" Despite himself, Tappan found his gaze drawn to the indicated spot. As he watched, the fabric began to move aside, revealing what lay beyond. The wall was not solid. It was a window looking into another chamber, this one even larger than the room where he was held. Within that space, Tappan could see figures moving in the dim red light, but it took his mind several moments to process what he was actually witnessing. The three missing women were there, Mary, Sarah, and Beth, but they were no longer quite human. Their skin had the same waxy quality as Jasper's, and their movements were fluid in ways that suggested their bones had somehow become more flexible. They wore robes of translucent silk that revealed bodies marked with the same scarred symbols, and their faces were locked in expressions of such profound ecstasy that looking at them was almost physically painful. They moved together in a complex dance, their bodies intertwining and separating in patterns that seemed to follow some mathematical precision. Other figures joined them, men and women that Tappan didn't recognize, all bearing the same marks, all moving with the same inhuman grace. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jasper whispered. "They've transcended the limitations of ordinary flesh. Pain and pleasure have become one for them, and every sensation is magnified beyond mortal comprehension." Tappan forced himself to look away, bile rising in his throat. "This is madness. This is evil. Evil." Jasper's laugh was sharper now. "Sheriff, what we practice here is the purest form of worship ever conceived. We offer ourselves completely, body, mind, and soul, to forces that exist beyond the petty morality of your limited world. In return, we receive experiences that would shatter lesser minds." He moved closer to the bed, and Tappan could smell something wrong about him. Not just the sweet corruption that filled the air, but something deeper, as if decay had set in while the man still lived. "You see, my dear Sheriff, my family has been guardian to a great secret for over a century. Beneath this house lies a chamber built by the original inhabitants of this land. People who understood that the divine takes many forms, not all of them comforting to the weak-minded. When my ancestor purchased this property, he thought to seal away their legacy. But the sacred cannot be contained by mere stone and mortar." Jasper began to pace around the bed, his movements too fluid, too graceful for normal human anatomy. The influence seeped up through the foundations, into our dreams, our desires. Generation after generation of Caldwells fought against it, trying to maintain their facade of Christian respectability. But I embraced it. I opened the sealed chamber and allowed the true masters to reclaim their rightful place. "Masters?" Tappan's voice was hoarse. "Entities that existed before your jealous god ever dreamed of creating humans in his own limited image. They offer a different path, one where the flesh becomes a temple for experiences beyond imagination, where pain and pleasure merge into something transcendent." Jasper stopped pacing and leaned over the bed, his face inches from Tappan's. The sheriff could see that the man's eyes were no longer entirely human. The pupils had elongated into vertical slits, and behind them swirled depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical constraints of skull and brain. "The women came to us willingly once they understood what we offered. Your deputy as well. He begged to join our celebrations before the transformation was complete, and soon you'll make the same choice." "Never," Tappan spat. "Oh, but you will." Jasper's smile revealed teeth that had been filed to points. "You see, the process has already begun. That sweet scent you've been breathing, it carries more than just perfume. Even now it's working its way through your bloodstream, preparing your nervous system for enhancement." As if summoned by his words, Tappan became aware of strange sensations creeping through his body. His skin felt hypersensitive, as if every thread of the silk restraints was sending jolts of sensation directly to his brain. The red candlelight seemed brighter, more vivid, and he could hear sounds that hadn't been there before. Whispers in languages that predated human speech, melodies that seemed to originate from within his own bones. "Fight it all you like," Jasper murmured. "The transformation is inevitable. Soon, you'll understand that what you call horror is actually rapture beyond description." Through the window into the other chamber, Tappan could see the dancers moving faster now, their bodies blurring together in patterns that defied geometric possibility. The sound of their combined voices rose in harmonies that made his skull ache with pressure. And despite his revulsion, he found part of his mind trying to follow the complex rhythms. "Tell me about the chamber beneath the house," he said, trying to focus on something other than the spreading warmth in his veins. "Tell me how this started." Jasper's expression grew dreamy, distant. The original inhabitants called it the heart of Ecstasy. They built it as a gateway, a place where the barriers between our world and theirs could be dissolved through acts of absolute surrender. For centuries, it lay dormant, waiting for someone with the proper bloodline to awaken it. Bloodline? "The Caldwells are not entirely human, Sheriff. My ancestor's wife carried blood from the original builders of this place, passed down through generations of careful breeding. When Judge Ezekiel first entered the chamber, it recognized him as kin and began to sing in his dreams." Jasper moved to one of the reversed mirrors and ran his fingers along its frame. Each generation grew stronger, more attuned to the call. My father could hear the whispers even with the chamber sealed. My grandfather saw visions of the rituals in his sleep, but I was born to be their vessel. The sensations in Tappan's body were growing stronger. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more complex, and he was becoming aware of textures and scents that his normal senses had never been able to detect. The silk against his skin felt like water, like fire, like the caress of wind made tangible. The process is accelerating, Jasper observed with satisfaction. Soon you'll be ready to join our celebration. And what a celebration it will be. We've been preparing for weeks for the arrival of new participants. Others are coming? Oh yes. The young seminary student was just the beginning. The influence spreads like ripples in a pond, drawing the worthy to us. Even now, 7 more seminarians walk the roads toward our estate, compelled by dreams they cannot resist. By tomorrow's dawn, we'll have enough participants for the Grand Communion. Tappan's heart raced, not from fear now, but from something else entirely. The thought of 7 innocent young men falling into this nightmare should have filled him with horror, but instead he found himself curious about what form their transformation would take. The realization of his changing thoughts snapped him back to momentary clarity. You have to stop this. Those men are innocents. Innocence is overrated, Jasper replied. What we offer is so much more valuable. The complete abandonment of the self in service to sensation. No more fear, no more pain that isn't also pleasure. No more limitations imposed by squeamish morality. He gestured toward the window again, and Tappan found himself unable to resist looking. The dancers had formed a complex pattern now, their bodies creating geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. At the center of their formation, something was beginning to materialize, a shadow that was somehow darker than the surrounding darkness, with suggestions of form that hurt to contemplate directly. They're calling our true masters into this realm, Jasper explained. Each act of worship, each surrender of individual will, opens the barriers a little wider. Soon they'll be able to manifest fully in our world, and then, he spread his arms wide, then all of humanity will have the opportunity to experience true transcendence. The shadow at the center of the dancers was growing more solid, and Tappan could begin to make out details that his mind insisted couldn't be real. Writhing appendages that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3, surfaces that reflected light in impossible ways, and something that might have been eyes, hundreds of them, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence vast and alien. Magnificent, isn't it? Jasper breathed. And this is only the smallest manifestation of their glory. In the chamber below, the true rituals take place. Despite the chemical changes coursing through his system, Tappan forced himself to focus on the practical. How many people are down there? Dozens. Some have been with us for months, others for years. The process of transformation takes time, you see. The human form must be gradually prepared to handle the intensity of divine communion. But the wait is worth it. Those who complete the full transformation become something beyond human imagination. The shadow entity had solidified enough now that Tappan could see it was not one being but many, their forms intertwined in configurations that made his eyes water. The dancers around it were no longer quite human either. Their limbs had elongated, their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed impossible anatomies beneath. What happens to them? He whispered. They become conduits, Jasper said reverently. Perfect vessels for experiences that would destroy unenhanced minds. They feel everything, every sensation multiplied 1,000-fold, every emotion magnified beyond mortal comprehension. Pain becomes indistinguishable from pleasure, horror from ecstasy. They exist in a state of constant rapture. The chemicals in Tappan's system were reaching a crescendo now. The room around him seemed to breathe with its own life, the red fabric walls pulsing like the interior of some vast organism. He could feel his resistance crumbling, his mind opening to possibilities that had seemed abhorrent only moments before. "Yes," Jasper murmured, watching the change in the sheriff's expression. "Let it happen. Stop fighting and simply experience." But even as his consciousness began to fragment, Tappan held on to one last coherent thought. Somehow, he had to find a way to warn the outside world about what was happening here. If the influence was spreading to the seminary, if more innocent people were being drawn into this nightmare, someone had to stop it. The problem was, with each passing moment, he was becoming less certain that it should be stopped at all. Father Benedict Hawthorne knelt in the chapel of Richmond Theological Seminary, his knees raw against the stone floor where he had been praying for the past 3 hours. Before him, the altar crucifix seemed to blur in the candlelight, and no matter how fervently he beseeched the Almighty for guidance, the silence of heaven pressed down upon him like a weight. Timothy Marsh remained bound to the oak tree, his inhuman humming having drawn 6 more seminarians into a trance-like state before Father Hawthorne had managed to establish a proper cordon. The affected students stood in a circle around the tree, swaying slightly, their eyes rolled back and their mouths moving in silent communion with forces the old priest dared not name. Worse still, the influence was spreading beyond the seminary grounds. Reports had reached him of strange behavior throughout Henrico County, farmers abandoning their fields to walk aimlessly toward the Caldwell estate, children singing lullabies in languages that predated European settlement, entire families found standing motionless in their homes, staring in the direction of the mansion with expressions of terrible longing. "Father?" Brother Marcus entered the chapel, his young face drawn with exhaustion and something approaching despair. "I've returned from Richmond with the materials you requested." Father Hawthorne rose stiffly, joints protesting after hours of kneeling. "Did you face any difficulties with the church authorities?" They were reluctant to provide the items. The bishop questioned why we needed blessed silver, consecrated salt, and texts from the restricted archives. I may have been less than completely forthcoming about our situation. The priest accepted the heavy leather satchel Marcus offered. Inside, wrapped in white silk, were implements that the church officially denied possessing, tools forged in an age when the line between faith and what lesser minds called witchcraft was far thinner than modern doctrine would admit. "You did well, my son. The church hierarchy would never approve our actions if they knew the full scope of what we face. They would call for committees and investigations while innocent souls are consumed by damnation." Father Hawthorne lifted out a crucifix, unlike any in the seminary's regular collection. This one was carved from a single piece of black oak and inlaid with silver in patterns that predated Christianity by centuries, symbols of binding and banishment that the early church had incorporated into their arsenal of spiritual warfare. "What of Sheriff Tappan?" Marcus asked. "Surely he would have sent word if he had found anything at the Caldwell estate." "I fear the sheriff has met with misfortune. I sent Brother Francis to town this morning. Tappan never returned to his office. His horse was found wandering the roads near the estate, but there was no sign of the sheriff himself." Father Hawthorne moved to the restricted texts Marcus had brought from Richmond. The first was bound in leather so old it had turned nearly black, its pages yellowed with age and careful handling. "Malleus Demonicum," he read from the faded spine. "The Church's most comprehensive guide to spiritual contamination and cleansing, written by Cardinal Toretti after the Venice incident of 1634. He opened the book carefully, its spine cracking with age. The pages within were covered in meticulous Latin script, interrupted by diagrams that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. Father Hawthorne found the section he sought, a chapter devoted to what the cardinal had termed ecstatic possessions. "Listen to this, Marcus," the priest said, his voice heavy with dread. "When demonic entities seek not to torment, but to seduce, when their goal is not the destruction of the soul, but its willing surrender. Traditional methods of exorcism prove insufficient. The possessed do not writhe in agony, but rather in rapture, and their very pleasure becomes a barrier to salvation. Marcus leaned closer, his face pale in the flickering light. How does one combat such influence? The corruption must be burned out completely. Father Hawthorne continued reading. Half measures only spread the contagion. Fire and silver, blessed salt and consecrated iron, these may cleanse the immediate infection, but the source itself must be found and destroyed utterly, lest it regenerate like a cancer in the body of Christ. A commotion outside interrupted their study. Through the chapel windows, they could see Brother Francis running across the seminary grounds, his robes billowing behind him. When he burst through the chapel doors, his face was flushed with terror and exertion. "Father, the tree! Something's happening to the tree!" They followed Francis outside, where a crowd of seminarians had gathered at the safe distance Father Hawthorne had established. Even from 50 yards away, they could see that the ancient oak had begun to change. Its bark was splitting and peeling away in long strips, revealing wood underneath that gleamed wet and red in the afternoon sun. The branches were moving despite the absence of any wind, writhing like the limbs of some enormous organism in pain. Timothy Marsh remained bound to the roots, but his body had undergone its own transformation. His skin had taken on the same translucent quality Father Hawthorne had read about in the forbidden texts, and through it they could see veins that pulsed with luminous fluid. His humming had grown louder, more complex, harmonizing with sounds that seemed to emerge from the tree itself. The 6 seminarians standing in the circle around the oak had begun to move, their bodies swaying in perfect synchronization. As Father Hawthorne watched in horror, he realized they were sinking, not into the earth, but into shadows that had no natural source, as if the very ground beneath their feet was becoming insubstantial. "Get the blessed salt," he ordered Marcus. "Form a barrier around the affected area. No one else can be allowed to approach." As Marcus ran to fetch the supplies, Father Hawthorne opened the Malleus Demonicum to a page marked with a black ribbon. The text here was different, not Latin, but something older, words that seemed to resist pronunciation by human vocal cords. But he had studied the phonetic guides Cardinal Toretti had provided, and he began to speak the ancient syllables of banishment. The effect was immediate and violent. Timothy's humming rose to a shriek that shattered windows throughout the seminary, and the oak tree convulsed as if struck by lightning. The 6 swaying seminarians suddenly collapsed, their connection to whatever force had been sustaining them severed. But even as Father Hawthorne continued the recitation, he could feel resistance building. The entity, or entities, controlling the oak were not easily dismissed. Power flowed through the tree's transformed wood, power that had been building for over a century, drawing strength from each act of corruption performed in the Caldwell mansion. "Father," Marcus had returned with the blessed salt and was pouring it in careful lines around the oak. Where the consecrated crystals touched the ground, steam rose as if the earth itself were burning. "The salt won't hold, something's pushing against it." Indeed, the white lines Marcus had drawn were beginning to buckle and break, as if invisible forces were pressing outward from the tree. Father Hawthorne raised his voice, shouting the banishment words with increasing desperation, but he could feel his strength ebbing against the tide of accumulated corruption. Then, from the direction of the Caldwell estate, came a sound that made his blood freeze. It was music, if the word could apply to harmonies that seemed designed to drive listeners insane. Multiple voices joined in impossible configurations, creating melodies that existed in more dimensions than human ears were meant to perceive. And underneath it all, a rhythm that matched the pulsing of infected veins, the beat of transformed hearts. "They're calling to it," Father Hawthorne realized with growing horror. "Whatever's in that tree is just an extension of something larger. The real source is still at the mansion, The 6 collapsed seminarians began to stir, their movements sluggish but purposeful. As they climbed to their feet, Father Hawthorne could see that their eyes had changed. The irises now swirled with golden flecks that moved with hypnotic patterns. They turned toward the estate as one, their faces blank but somehow expectant. "Stop them!" Father Hawthorne commanded, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. The transformed students began to walk, their movements perfectly synchronized, heading directly toward the source of the impossible music. Other seminarians tried to intercept them, but the moment anyone made physical contact with the affected students, they too fell under the influence, their eyes taking on the same golden swirl. Within minutes, a procession of nearly 20 young men was walking steadily toward the Caldwell estate, their faces serene and terrible in their emptiness. Those who remained unaffected could only watch helplessly as their brothers marched toward damnation with the peaceful expressions of the truly blessed. "We have to follow them," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the continuing music from the mansion. "We can't just let them walk into that place." Father Hawthorne nodded grimly, gathering the sacred implements from his satchel. The crucifix of black oak felt warm in his hands, as if responding to the proximity of its ancient enemy. The blessed silver burned against his skin where it touched, and the vial of consecrated oil seemed to vibrate with contained power. "Gather what men you can who haven't been affected," he told Marcus. "Arm them with whatever blessed items we have in the chapel, and send word to Richmond. If we fail here, the church must be warned about what they face." And as they prepared for what might be their final mission, Father Hawthorne found himself thinking of Cardinal Toretti's final words in the Malleus Daemonicum. When confronting entities of such power, remember that martyrdom may be the only victory possible. Better to die in service to the light than to live as a conduit for the darkness. The procession of transformed seminarians had disappeared into the tobacco fields, following the dirt road toward the Caldwell mansion. In their wake, the ancient oak continued to writhe and pulse, its corrupted wood weeping sap that gleamed like liquid silver in the fading daylight. Father Hawthorne shouldered his satchel of sacred implements and began the walk that would either see the evil cleansed from Henrico County or witness his own soul added to the growing collection of the damned. Behind him, the seminary bells began to toll. Not the measured call to evening prayers, but the rapid, desperate clang of alarm. The sound carried across the fields like a warning, though whether anyone remained with the will to heed it was a question that only the approaching darkness would answer. The basement chamber beneath the Caldwell mansion defied every law of architecture and physics that Sheriff William Tappan thought he understood. The walls curved impossibly inward, while simultaneously stretching away into distances that shouldn't have been able to fit within the foundation of any earthly structure. The ceiling, if it could be called that, was lost in shadows that seemed to move with independent purpose, occasionally revealing glimpses of geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Tappan found himself able to move freely now, the silk restraints having been removed hours or perhaps days ago. Time had become fluid in this place, marked not by the movement of sun and moon, but by the rhythm of the rituals that took place in the chamber's center. His body felt strange, lighter somehow, as if the very substance of his flesh had been altered at a molecular level. The chemical transformation Jasper had begun upstairs was now complete. Where once Tappan had felt revulsion at the sights around him, he now experienced a detached fascination that bordered on aesthetic appreciation. The dancers moving through their impossible geometries were beautiful in ways that transcended ordinary human concepts of beauty. Their transformed bodies bent and flowed like living liquid, creating sculptures of flesh that existed only for moments before dissolving into new configurations. "You're adapting remarkably well," Jasper observed, approaching through the crowd of celebrants. The master of the house had undergone further changes since bringing Tappan to the chamber. His skin now possessed the same translucent quality as the other long-term residents, and the scars on his chest had begun to glow with a faint phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. "I understand now," Tappan replied, surprised by the calm in his own voice. "What you offer here, it's not corruption, it's evolution." "Precisely." Jasper's smile was radiant with genuine pleasure. "You see how limited our former existence was, trapped by flesh that could feel only crude sensations, minds that could comprehend only the most basic forms of reality. Here, we become something greater, conduits for experiences that exist beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding." Around them, the ritual continued without pause. The original three missing women, Mary, Sarah, and Beth, had progressed far beyond their initial transformation. Their bodies now seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, sometimes appearing almost human, other times taking on configurations that suggested they were no longer bound by conventional anatomy. They moved through the other celebrants like dancers through water, their very presence leaving trails of luminescence in the air. "Where are the seminary students?" Tappan asked, though he was no longer certain why the question seemed important. "They're being prepared in the adjacent chambers," Jasper replied. "The process must be gradual for those who arrive with strong spiritual defenses. Their minds require careful conditioning before they can appreciate the full glory of what we offer." He gestured toward a series of arched openings in the chamber walls, doorways that definitely hadn't been there when Tappan first descended into this space. Through one of them, he could glimpse a smaller room where figures in seminary robes knelt in perfect rows, their heads bowed in what might have been prayer or surrender. "Father Hawthorne will come," Tappan said, though he wasn't sure why the thought occurred to him. "He won't abandon his students." "I'm counting on it," Jasper replied with evident satisfaction. "The good father represents the most delicious challenge we've faced in decades. A man of true faith, fortified by decades of spiritual discipline, his transformation will be a masterwork." In the center of the chamber, the shadow entities that Tappan had glimpsed upstairs were now manifesting more fully. What had seemed like darkness given form was revealing itself to be something far more complex, beings of such alien geometry that human eyes could only perceive fragments of their true nature. They moved through dimensions that intersected with but transcended the physical space of the chamber, their presence causing reality itself to bend and flow like heated wax. "Are they gods?" Tappan found himself asking. "They are what gods become when they evolve beyond the need for worship," Jasper answered reverently. "They don't demand obedience or fear, they offer partnership, union. The chance to experience existence on a level that makes our former lives seem like the dreams of children." One of the entities, a writhing mass of angles that suggested wings, tentacles, and limbs without being any of those things, extended something that might have been an appendage toward the kneeling seminarians. Where it touched them, their robes began to dissolve, revealing skin that was already beginning to show the telltale signs of transformation. "The process accelerates when they make direct contact," Jasper explained. "What would normally take weeks of careful preparation can be accomplished in hours when the masters themselves participate in the initiation." Through another archway, Tappan could see more chambers extending into the distance, rooms filled with celebrants in various stages of transformation, each one a testament to the entity's power to remake human flesh according to alien aesthetics. Some had developed additional limbs that moved with impossible grace. Others had undergone changes that affected their very perception of reality, their eyes now capable of seeing spectrums of light that didn't exist in the natural world. "How long has this been going on?" Tappan asked. "In this location? Over a century. But the masters themselves are eternal. They existed before our sun was born and will continue long after it dies." They've guided the evolution of countless species across infinite worlds, always offering the same gift: transcendence through surrender, ecstasy through transformation. A commotion near one of the chamber entrances drew their attention. Father Hawthorne had arrived, along with a small group of seminarians carrying crosses and other religious implements. The sight of them should have filled Tappan with hope for rescue, but instead he felt only a mild curiosity about how quickly they would succumb to the chamber's influence. "Ah, our final guests have arrived," Jasper murmured with evident pleasure. "And just in time for the culmination of tonight's ritual." Father Hawthorne stepped into the chamber, his aged face set in lines of grim determination. In his hands, he carried the black oak crucifix that Tappan somehow knew was no ordinary religious symbol. The moment it crossed the threshold, the air itself seemed to recoil, and several of the transformed celebrants stumbled as if struck by invisible blows. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," the priest began, his voice carrying clearly despite the impossible acoustics of the space, "I command you to release these innocent souls." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Light blazed from the crucifix, not the warm, golden glow of ordinary candlelight, but something harsher, more primal. Where it touched the transformed celebrants, they cried out in voices that harmonized in impossible ways, their bodies writhing as if the light caused them physical pain. But even as Father Hawthorne advanced into the chamber, Tappan could see that his small band of followers was already succumbing. The seminarians who had entered with him were swaying on their feet, their eyes beginning to show the telltale golden swirls that indicated the beginning of transformation. The chamber's influence was too strong, too pervasive to be resisted by ordinary faith. "Impressive," Jasper said, apparently untroubled by the priest's dramatic entrance. "But ultimately futile. He brings weapons forged in an age when the masters were weaker, when their influence could be contained by simple symbols and consecrated metal. Those days are long past." Indeed, as Father Hawthorne pressed deeper into the chamber, the light from his crucifix began to dim. The alien geometries around him seemed to absorb the radiance, converting it into something else, patterns of shadow and luminescence that were somehow more beautiful and terrible than the original light. "You cannot stop what is already complete," Jasper called out to the priest. "These people came to us willingly, seeking experiences that your limited faith could never provide. They have found transcendence, Father. Would you truly drag them back to the grey mediocrity of ordinary existence?" Father Hawthorne faltered, his step slowing as he looked around the chamber. Tappan could see the doubt creeping into the old man's eyes as he took in the faces of the transformed, expressions of such profound joy and wonder that even a lifetime of religious conviction couldn't easily dismiss them as mere corruption. "This is not God's plan," the priest said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Whose God?" Jasper asked gently. "The petty tyrant who demands worship and obedience, the jealous deity who forbids his children from experiencing the full spectrum of existence. Father, look around you. See what your God would deny humanity, the chance to become something greater than the sum of our mortal limitations." The shadow entities in the chamber's center had begun to move closer, their impossible forms creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to speak directly to the viewer's nervous system. Tappan watched as Father Hawthorne's companions, the few who had retained enough self-control to make it this far, began to lower their weapons and remove their religious symbols. "The choice is theirs to make," Jasper continued, his voice taking on hypnotic qualities that seemed to resonate in the chamber's strange acoustics. "Just as it was yours, Sheriff. Just as it is yours now, Father. We offer no force, no coercion, only the opportunity to experience what lies beyond the boundaries of conventional flesh." Father Hawthorne looked directly at Tappan then, and in that moment of eye contact, the sheriff felt a brief flicker of his former self, an echo of the man who had sworn to protect the innocent, who had believed in justice and law and the basic decency of human civilization. "Help me," the priest whispered, his voice barely audible over the harmonious chorus of the transformed. Tappan felt the request resonate through the altered pathways of his nervous system. For a moment, two conflicting sets of desires warred within him. The new consciousness that saw beauty in corruption and transcendence in surrender, and the older self that remembered duty and honor and the weight of a badge worn in service to others. The chamber held its breath, waiting to see which aspect of his divided nature would prove stronger. The moment stretched like eternity as Sheriff William Tappan stood frozen between two incompatible realities. In one, he was a transformed being, capable of experiencing pleasures beyond mortal comprehension, part of a collective consciousness that had transcended the limitations of ordinary humanity. In the other, he was a lawman sworn to protect the innocent, watching helplessly as good people were consumed by an alien corruption that wore the mask of transcendence. Father Hawthorne's whispered plea echoed in the chamber's impossible acoustics, reverberating through dimensions that human ears weren't meant to perceive. Around them, the transformed celebrants had begun to move closer, their bodies flowing like liquid silk through the air, creating patterns that suggested music made visible. "The choice is beautiful in its simplicity," Jasper murmured, his golden-flecked eyes fixed on Tappan's face. "Embrace evolution, or cling to the primitive certainties of a dying age. But choose quickly, Sheriff. The ritual reaches its culmination, and soon there will be no choice left to make." Indeed, the shadow entities at the chamber's center were growing more solid with each passing moment. What had been suggestions of form were now acquiring substance that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Tappan could see, with senses that definitely hadn't existed before his transformation, that the beings were preparing to complete their manifestation in the physical world. Once that happened, their influence would spread far beyond the confines of the Caldwell estate. Every human within hundreds of miles would feel the call to surrender, to experience the ecstasy of dissolution. The infection would spread like wildfire across Virginia, then beyond, until the entire continent was transformed into something that bore only superficial resemblance to humanity. "Father," Tappan said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chamber's acoustic distortions, "the crucifix, it's not meant to banish them, it's meant to seal them." Father Hawthorne's eyes widened with sudden understanding. The black oak crucifix in his hands wasn't a weapon but a key, a tool designed to lock the entities back into whatever dimension they had originally inhabited. But using it would require getting close enough to the manifestation point, and that meant passing through the crowd of transformed celebrants who now surrounded them on all sides. "Fascinating," Jasper said, apparently untroubled by this revelation. "You think to trap beings who exist beyond your concepts of space and time? Sheriff, you understand so little about what you face." But Tappan was already moving, his transformed body flowing through the crowd of celebrants with inhuman grace. The chemicals in his system had changed more than just his perceptions. They had enhanced his physical capabilities, allowing him to move in ways that should have been impossible for human anatomy. He reached Father Hawthorne just as the first of the transformed seminarians made contact with the priest's remaining companions. The young men who had followed their mentor into this nightmare were succumbing rapidly, their faces taking on the same expressions of rapturous surrender that marked all the chamber's long-term residents. "Give me the crucifix," Tappan said urgently. "I can get closer to them than you can." "You're one of them now," Father Hawthorne replied, but his voice held doubt rather than certainty. "How do I know this isn't another deception?" "Because," Tappan said, looking directly into the priest's eyes, "I remember what it means to serve something greater than myself. And what they offer isn't service, it's slavery, disguised as freedom." The truth of those words resonated through his transformed consciousness like a bell. Whatever the entities had done to his body and mind, they hadn't been able to completely erase the core of who he was, the man who had sworn to protect others, even at the cost of his own life. Father Hawthorne handed over the crucifix, its ancient wood warm to the touch. The moment Tappan's fingers closed around it, he felt power flow through him. Not the alien energies that had been changing his body, but something older and more fundamental. The light that blazed from the religious symbol wasn't fighting the chamber's influence so much as offering an alternative to it. "In the name of all who choose duty over desire," Tappan said, surprising himself with the words, "I reject the gifts of corruption." He began to move toward the center of the chamber, where the shadow entities were reaching the final stages of their manifestation. The transformed celebrants tried to intercept him, but their movements, for all their inhuman grace, were predictable in ways that his enhanced senses could read and counter. Jasper Caldwell appeared directly in his path, the man's body shifting between solid flesh and something more fluid. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he said, his voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "We are beyond your reach now, beyond any earthly authority." "Maybe," Tappan replied, raising the crucifix, "but I'm not entirely earthly anymore, am I?" The light that burst from the religious symbol was different now, not the harsh radiance that had initially blazed from it, but something more complex. It contained elements of the same alien energies that permeated the chamber, but twisted in ways that served human rather than inhuman purposes. Jasper screamed, a sound that contained harmonics that shattered the chamber's carefully maintained acoustic balance. Around them, the other transformed celebrants stumbled as their collective consciousness was disrupted by the discordant note. Tappan pressed forward, each step bringing him closer to the entities at the chamber's heart. He could feel their attention focusing on him now, vast intelligences that spanned galaxies, turning their regard toward one insignificant human who dared to challenge their right to remake his species. The pressure was enormous, not physical but mental, psychological, spiritual. They offered him visions of what he could become if he stopped fighting, experiences that would make the transformation he had already undergone seem like the first tentative steps of an infant learning to walk. But underneath those seductive promises, he could sense something else: fear. The entities were afraid of what the crucifix represented, not because of its religious significance, but because of what it had been designed to do. Cardinal Toretti had faced beings like these before, had learned their weaknesses through bitter experience. "The seal is breaking," Father Hawthorne called out from behind him. Indeed, Tappan could see cracks appearing in the chamber's walls. Not physical damage, but tears in the dimensional barriers that kept the entities contained within this space. If those barriers failed completely, there would be no stopping the spread of influence. Every human on Earth would eventually fall under their sway, transformed into something that served alien purposes rather than human ones. Tappan reached the center of the chamber just as the largest of the entities began to solidify into something that his eyes could fully perceive. It was beautiful in the way that natural disasters were beautiful. Terrible and magnificent and utterly indifferent to human concepts of morality or mercy. "I offer you one final chance," it spoke, its voice containing harmonics that bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to his nervous system. "Join us willingly, and we will make you a prince among the transformed. Resist, and we will remake you anyway, but without the dignity of choice." "I've already made my choice," Tappan replied, raising the crucifix above his head. "I choose to remain human." The light that erupted from the ancient wood was blinding, not just to normal sight, but to the enhanced perceptions his transformation had granted him. It filled the chamber completely, reaching into every corner and crevice, touching every transformed celebrant and restored seminarian alike. But this time, instead of causing pain, the light seemed to offer a different kind of choice. Those who had been transformed could feel their original selves returning, not forced back into human shape, but offered the chance to choose which version of themselves they preferred to be. Some, like Jasper Caldwell, fought against the restoration, clinging to their alien enhancements even as the light burned away the chemical and spiritual changes that had made those enhancements possible. They dissolved into shadow, their consciousness merging with the entities they had served, becoming part of something vast and inhuman that existed beyond the boundaries of physical reality. Others, the more recently transformed, those who had retained some connection to their original humanity, chose differently. The three missing women, the seminary students, even Deputy Marcus Webb, whose transformation Tappan now remembered witnessing in what felt like another lifetime, accepted the light's offer and felt their bodies returning to merely human configurations. The entities themselves were being drawn back through the dimensional barriers, their manifestation in physical reality unraveling like a tapestry with its threads cut. But even as they retreated, their voices echoed through the chamber with promises and threats. "This is not an ending," they whispered in harmonies that would haunt the survivors' dreams for years to come. "We have touched this world now, left our mark upon it. Others will find the paths we have opened, will complete what we have begun." The chamber began to collapse. Not physically, but dimensionally, its impossible geometries folding in upon themselves as the alien influences that had sustained them were withdrawn. Father Hawthorne grabbed Tappan's arm, pulling him toward the stairway that led back to the mansion's basement. "We have to get everyone out," the priest shouted over the sound of reality reshaping itself. "The whole structure is becoming unstable." They ran through corridors that shifted and changed with each step, gathering the restored victims as they fled toward what they hoped was still the surface world. Behind them, the chamber collapsed completely, its exotic materials returning to ordinary stone and wood as the last traces of alien influence faded. They emerged into a basement that was now merely a basement, damp, dark, and reassuringly normal. Above them, they could hear the sound of the mansion's upper floors settling as supernatural forces that had supported impossible architectural features withdrew their influence. "Is it over?" Mary Hutchins asked, her voice hoarse from screaming that she couldn't quite remember. Like the others, she retained fragmentary memories of her transformation, enough to know that something terrible had happened, but not enough to drive her insane with the full knowledge of what she had become. "For now," Father Hawthorne replied, helping the last of the seminary students up the stairs. "But we must be vigilant. Evil like this leaves scars that can be reopened if we're not careful." They reached the mansion's main floor to find it already showing signs of decay. Without the entity's influence to sustain it, the building was rapidly returning to its natural state, that of a structure that had been abandoned for over a year. Paint peeled from the walls, floorboards sagged under their weight, and the windows that had been boarded shut now showed glimpses of ordinary daylight. "What happens now?" Tappan asked as they gathered in the mansion's foyer. He still felt changed, not physically, but in ways that were perhaps more fundamental. He had seen beyond the boundaries of normal human experience and chosen to return, but that choice had left its own marks upon his soul. "Now we rebuild," Father Hawthorne said firmly. "We heal the wounded, we cleanse this place completely, and we prepare for the possibility that other such sites exist." The entities spoke truly. They have touched our world, and that touch will not easily fade. As they walked away from the Caldwell mansion, Tappan looked back to see it settling into complete ruin. The exotic gardens were already withering, the unnatural roses returning to ordinary thorns and leaves. Within days, it would be indistinguishable from any other abandoned property in rural Virginia, but he could still feel something underneath the ordinary surface, a potential for corruption that waited like a seed in poisoned soil. The entities might be gone, but they had left behind changed possibilities, alternative paths that future seekers might discover and choose to follow. The battle was won, but the war between human and inhuman definitions of transcendence would continue for as long as people yearned for experiences beyond the limitations of mortal flesh. And sometimes in his dreams, William Tappan still heard the harmonious voices calling from beyond the boundaries of reality, promising ecstasies that no merely human consciousness could imagine. He had chosen to remain human, but the choice would have to be made again and again by each generation that encountered the shadows left behind by the Caldwell family's depraved rituals. The price of humanity, he had learned, was eternal vigilance against the seductive promise of becoming something more and less than human. In the distance, the bells of Richmond Theological Seminary began to toll, calling the faithful to evening prayers. But underneath their familiar bronze voices, those with enhanced hearing could detect other harmonics, echoes of alien music that would never entirely fade from the world. The story of the Caldwell mansion was over. The legacy of what had happened there had only just begun.